jeez.
All right, a couple of things. Faculty just went a COVID-19 briefing during the Jewel time today. So we're making contingency plans tomorrow, Wednesday. Faculty are going to be reading some prepared statement that we're required to read to you. I've already talked to you a little bit about this before now because I've been trying to be thinking proactively. Over the weekend, Stanford and a number of University of California campuses basically suspended in-class meetings for the remainder of their winter term. They're on a quarter system, so they do a fall quarter, a winter quarter, and a spring quarter. So they basically suspended in-class meetings. They're still teaching their classes, but they're teaching them all remotely using online tools. I'm relatively well equipped to do this already because I'm familiar with ways of delivering that material in both things like Zoom teleconferencing, things which I've done for a student who needed to take evolution and ecology in the past, but couldn't because of scheduling make it to the classes, so we did Zoom sessions with her. So I think I'm pretty well suited to finish out animal behavior without any serious snafus. We can do online testing, et cetera, in the event that you're told to go home to your homes. At some point, I need each of you to tell me whether or not you have internet service at your houses, simply so I know, so that if you don't, and we have to start holding class online from your homes, I have contingency plans for you. That said, I've been talking to practically all of you about a research project in lab, and we started making plans for those things. Some of those things are going to require expenditure of money, and I don't necessarily want to spend departmental funding on something that 3 or 4 weeks from now you won't be doing because you won't be here. So just as a preemptive kind of thing, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove that from the criteria for making an A in the class, simply because I would be kind of surprised. We just, today they just reported the first cases of COVID in Missouri and Kansas. One of them is in Johnson County, right here in Kansas. The one that is in Missouri is right here in the Kansas City area. I'll be very surprised if we're meeting together in class sessions at the end of the semester.
Wait. So you think that we're not gonna come back?
Oh, I think you're going to come back. I just think there's probably going to be some time between now and finals week when you will be sent home.
Like, what happens to like all of our stuff in that case?
Well, we're making contingency plans. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just looking ahead and saying, what can I do now that will make the rest of the semester a little more practical? I would rather you not start a bunch of projects that you're never going to finish. Now, it may be that nothing happens and we're all still having in-class sessions and lab sessions and things like that at the end of the semester. But what I don't want to do is spend a lot of time and effort and money setting up in-class projects that are going to be abandoned a month from now without ever coming to fruition. When I have the power to change the syllabus, there's a thing at the end of the syllabus that says, I can change this thing anytime I want. And this is a pretty decent reason for it. So it's a little thing that I have a little bit of control over that makes kind of thinking about the rest of the semester easier in the event that we do something to mitigate transmission. The reason people close schools is that you have to break the chain of transmission. And the way you do that is by social distancing. And you guys are not socially distant right now. It's so ironic. I'm sitting they had this meeting in the choir room. All the faculty are in there, all the coaching staff is in there. We're like in this choir room that is, I don't know, outfitted for 70 people, and there are 100 of us in there. We're all sitting 6 inches apart. I'm like, good COVID response.
Did you see the press conference of the lady who was telling people to not touch their face and hands or face and mouth?
No, I
She said we need to start washing our hands and not touching our face and mouth.
Yeah.
And then she proceeds to lick her finger to turn the page.
Nice.
I've
So-
got a lady from
So
Seattle
just
coming on Friday.
just to just so that you don't go down a path that you then end up abandoning because of situations beyond your control. Let's just alleviate that particular requirement for the lab, for the class, if you intend to get an A.
So what does that mean for us on all of the lab periods scheduled for?
What I think we might actually do, assuming that we're still meeting, is I'll just come up with some exercises where we go out into nature and do some actual observational things out in nature. Work in our observational skills. There are some data collecting protocols that I have for doing that sort of thing. So if we end up being in session the whole time, I'm not sure what that was.
Or like
Oh,
the
yeah.
transformer blowing.
I have alternatives for what to do with those weeks. So some of those weeks we're gonna be going into the field working on the snake project and crunching that data in lab, et cetera, et cetera. But for the remainder of the weeks at the end that we're scheduled for you working on your research projects, we'll probably just be doing some post-hoc things that I come up with, some of which I already have in the pipe, and I'll just come up with a couple of other things that'll still be doing behavior, but they won't be these long drawn-out independent projects. Yeah.
Follow up, since we're not getting to pick our research topic anymore, can we like submit maybe ideas for our lit review topics? too?
Yeah, so that was the other thing. Since some of you have expressed interest in certain areas, then probably those areas would be good places for you to begin. So if you have an idea for what you want to do a literature review on, certainly you can let me know that. If not, I'll probably be assigning those by Friday. So if you have an interest in the literature review topic, and then what will happen at the end is that will probably be your big, long writing task at the end, rather than putting together a presentation. You'll have a written task, and we'll just after it's assigned, you guys figure out about how long you need. We'll set a due date for that. On that front, wash your hands. 20 seconds, hot water, soap, sneeze into your shirt. Do social distancing to the degree to which you can, given that the fact that probably most or all of you live in dormitories and things like this. People who are in charge of research time, the research courses are talking to faculty in biology and chemistry about what to do in the event that we're not having on-campus activities at the time that you're supposed to be presenting your senior research, for those of you who are seniors. Once again, a health crisis shouldn't stand in the way of you completing your degree plan. There are all sorts of things that a lot of other people are thinking about, like people who are studying abroad, et cetera, et cetera. There's a nursing trip over the summer that was supposed to go to Italy, among other places. They have basically been told to either change locations or cancel that particular activity in the nursing department. So people are thinking about these things. We're thinking about undergraduate research as your senior thesis project, how that might be impacting how we can evaluate your final product for that work. So we're thinking about things and we're making changes. Some of them are changes that won't necessarily be implemented. Some of them are changes that we can just do to preempt things. And this seems like a preemption. Thanks for the progress that you have made. I think it would be fun to do some of the things that you guys are proposing. We just won't do them this semester. That said, don't freak out about this either, because you guys are in the best age class for surviving COVID. It's old guys like me who are getting hit hardest. What's that?
0.2% is the death rate for 20 to 29.
Yeah, you guys are set. So the United States has not had a great response to all of this. If you look at global death rate, South Korea has the lowest. We actually have the highest at about 5.8%. That's probably due to the fact that we're not testing people because we don't have testing capacity. South Korea has a really low death rate because the death rate, which is different from the mortality rate, is the number of people who die after being diagnosed with it. And South Korea has set up these drive-through testing centers. And so they've tested, well, last time I looked, they had tested over 150,000 people. And we've tested only people who are showing symptoms. And so our death rate looks high because we've only tested people who have actually been diagnosed.
Have you seen the video of them testing people where they'll like pull up in a car, like scan their forehead with a thermometer and then?
Oh, yeah, and then they take swabs,
Yeah,
you fill out a questionnaire, they take swabs, and it's just like going to a fast food place, it's,
This one, they had like shields and the person tried to like get back in their car and drive and they like threw a strip down and like.
oh, I didn't
drove
see
over
that.
the strip and then.
No, all the reports
they
I've
had, like
seen-
guns pointed at them and like shields and they like completely like.
Is this real, or is this something that you saw on some news outlet?
It was on
that
social
you shouldn't
media.
trust?
It was on
Okay,
social media.
so here's the other thing that I just wanna tell you. So in South Korea, they've been doing drive-through testing. You drive up, they give you a questionnaire, you fill it out, they take swabs of your nose and your mouth, they label those with your information, and you drive away. It takes like 15 minutes, I think, total. You drive away, and 2 or 3 days later, they send you the results of your test. As a result, they've been able to test a lot of people in a very quick and efficient way. A method that seems like custom made to Americans because you can get tested for COVID in less time than it takes to get a burger at Sonic. And so my other suggestion to you is get some good news sources. News sources that you can trust, news sources that are not based on social media. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is a really good place to get information because it's mainly staffed by career epidemiologists and doctors who actually just care mostly about getting correct information to policymakers in the American public, regardless of who happens to be sitting in the president's seat in the White House. So develop good news sources that you can trust. I personally like National Public Radio because they oftentimes piss me off by giving conservative people way too much leeway in not answering questions. They also do that plenty with liberals as well. I wish they would challenge people more often. But they also give you information that is good and timely without being hysterical about it. So it's generally good quality information. Find your outlet. On the right, it's not Fox News. On the left, it's not BuzzFeed. Find good sources of news that allow you to get good information that's not going to scare the shit out of you. And then pay attention to those people. When somebody from the CDC says something, you should probably listen to that. Don't panic, be informed, and behave appropriately. And now it's like specifications grading, I'm now up your anxiety level tenfold.
Where was the person from Missouri?
Yeah,
Like,
that's what I was gonna ask.
I think it was Johnson County, I heard on the news,
Or
yeah.
like, was this
Johnson
like a
County's
high school
Kansas.
student, or like?
It was Johnson County, Kansas, oh, so it was Johnson
I
County.
mean,
Johnson
Oh, it was
County.
St. Louis first.
St. Louis.
But still, Johnson County.
Johnson County.
Oh, it's Johnson
I
County,
mean, Johnson
Topeka?
County's
No.
dumb close.
No, Johnson County is southern Kansas City.
Yeah.
Yeah, Johnson County's dumb close.
We're on the
It's
other
just
side.
reported from Topeka, a lot of people
Yes.
are making that.
It is.
Cause that's where state office is.
I know, but what is that?
So it is in the Kansas City area, it's just right across the
Yeah.
state line.
40 minutes away.
Oh,
It's not in Fort Hays. Quite frankly, people in Fort Hays probably aren't even having these conversations because they have low population density. There's not probably a lot of people making international travel to places like Italy and China, et cetera, et cetera. They might not even be having contingency plans. Yes, Ken?
okay, now this is just like a thought.
Yes.
If you were us, would you, or would you not take all of the things you care about home with you during spring break?
Oh, yeah, so that was actually, somebody
It's like,
mentioned
I
this.
just wanna know if I'm gonna have an outfit.
Somebody actually mentioned this in the forum today, in the meeting that we had. Debbie Chastain actually suggested that when you go home for spring break, take anything that you might want in the event that something happens over spring break and you don't come back. So all of your electronics, all your chargers, anything of sentimental value, like don't pack up your entire dorm room, but take anything that you would find of value and useful to you, take it home with you because I mean, a lot can change. Let's see, I was listening to the news, coming back to school from lunch. And, it was in Italy, they jumped 140 deaths in a 24-hour period of time. So the news is developing rapidly in places where COVID is most prevalent. And so in 2 weeks, I don't know what's going to be going on. And neither do you, and neither does Sean Hannity, and neither does whoever is on BuzzFeed. The CDC knows what's going on and is up to date and puts out regular updates every couple of hours. I think there's keep yourselves informed, keep yourselves aware, distance yourselves from people to the degree to which you can. I'm actually considering not voting tomorrow in the Democratic primary because I can't go before I get to class in the morning because class is early, and I don't want to go in the evening when that's probably going to be when most people are. So I'm going to try and break away sometime in the middle of the day when there aren't going to be a ton of people there and go vote, simply so I can once again reduce my social contacts with other people. Stay healthy, get sleep. You guys probably get under 7 hours of sleep a night. If you're like most typical undergraduates, get sleep. Sleep, being well rested and healthy is the best thing that you can do for yourself. Don't go see movies. Don't go to the bowling alley.
Don't go on our spring break trips.
Depending on where your spring break trip is going,
Don't go to potty.
I'm going on a spring break trip. I'm going collecting. I'm going to be with Chris Cotton, and we're largely going to be by ourselves because we're going to be working late at nights, and we're not going to be probably coming into contact with many people other than one another. He's probably going to be sick of me by the time the trip is over. We will be doing our own form of social distancing by basically going field collecting for nocturnal lizards. But yeah, don't go to like, where's the place where college students typically
We're
go?
going to Myrtle
Padre?
Beach.
Oh.
You're going to Myrtle Beach. You know, be a little careful hanging out with 1,000 other college students on the beach somewhere.
Oh my god. Okay.
Sorry.
You're gonna be fine.
Alexis on the beach, her mask and a bikini, just like.
I'm gonna catch coronavirus with the Seattle woman who's coming to the microbiome conference on Friday.
We probably should have 0.2%. We're fine.
So you're telling me
You know, I
there's
did,
a
I did find it weird that they crammed us all into this little room, especially because the thing that's
The
affecting
thing is,
students
I would
most
just
right
sit
now
and,
at
like,
Jewel.
ignore it 'cause I'm like,
It's just a
"Ah,
common
I just
flu."
have a fever, it's
Do you know
fine."
it?
Why do people not get vaccinated?
In the US this year.
I got my flu shot.
You didn't get vaccinated.
I drink a lot more
Yes, you
juice
do.
It
though.
seems to work
So,
for me.
I just got I got mine.
I've been around a lot of flu
You're
positive.
gonna be
I've gotten
fine.
so many emails from the nurse with students of mine that have flu, just a common everyday seasonal flu. Like, you know, if you guys can't get vaccinated for flu and then stay away from other people when you have it, then there's no hope for you with coronavirus.
Oh
Alexis is like, my car's already packed.
Right.
I've got every single
She's
thing
gonna be
in
sitting
my
in the top
dorm
corner
room
of the lecture hall.
research today.
no. I am.
Once again,
Social
the
distancing.
purpose of all of this is to make you freak out and clean out your dorm room. But, you know, be thinking ahead. We're thinking ahead as faculty and administrators and facilities, et cetera, et cetera. Talk to your research advisors if you have things in cell culture. You know, if one of the concerns that we have as faculty is, what if one of us gets COVID and then we're out for 14 days? And what if
14.
It's 14 days of quarantine. Or what if if we're exposed to somebody who has COVID, we're required by school policy now to self-quarantine for 14 days, whether we're showing symptoms or whether we test positive or anything else. We're required to self-quarantine. What happens if that happens the Monday before finals? You have to finish that last week, you have to deliver finals, and you have to get grades turned in. What happens if you get COVID and you're incapacitated to the point that you can't teach any longer? Do other faculty members have access to your grades? Have you told your apartment chair where your grades reside? If your computer is software protected, you know, does the department chair have the password to your computer so that they can break into your computer and get your grades so that you can actually get grades for the semester, et cetera, et cetera. These are the things that you have to be thinking ahead about. We're in the process of thinking ahead. So be prepared for people to talk to you about how they're thinking ahead about things.
I was gonna ask, so we got that email today about like traveling and whatever and self-quarantining. So is that only if we travel to China, Iran, Korea, or Italy?
So there are different levels that the State Department has for risk. If you're traveling to a level 3 or a level 4 country, you need to report it to Sarah Round. There are 26 level 3 countries, 15 level 4 countries right now, but only 6 of those are actually at that level because of the coronavirus. So You can go onto the State Department's website, see what's level 3, level 4. But the ones that you need to worry about are those 6 that are actually on those lists because of the coronavirus. Are you planning on going to China or Italy?
Not over spring break, no. I mean, Italy later on, but I don't know where I'm traveling to yet, but it could potentially be international, but I don't wanna get back and have to self-quarantine myself, so.
Yeah, so
I think that sounds like a good way.
So go and look at the list on the State Department website and try and avoid those. Is somebody giving you like a surprise spring
No, we
break
could like,
trip?
no, it's just like, we have standby, so we're just gonna go
Oh,
to the
gotcha.
airport and be like, where can we go?
Hawaii's got some cheap flights right now.
Like I said, I'm scheduled to go to a conference in April. The flights have already been paid for, the hotel's already booked, et cetera. I'm like, I'm not going. They haven't told us yet if it's canceled. But it's in Washington DC.
I'm supposed to go to Italy.
And Washington DC already has a number of reports. Ted Cruz is self-quarantining because he came into contact with somebody who was diagnosed with the virus. Yeah, Caleb.
It's like a certain like threshold in which they actually like act on these plans.
Well, I mean, in Northern California and Washington, it's gotten widespread enough that once again, they're shutting down classes and things like this. Not because there are tons of people sick and dying, they're closing them down because by reducing contacts between humans, you break that communication of the disease. And so, shutting down college campuses is one way to increase social distance.
So we're just sort of monitoring cases in Johnson County.
Yeah, people are, the president's office and the provost's office is monitoring everything. In some cases, there may be statewide sorts of things that come down, like it happened in California, which is basically, that was a state level decision. There may come a point where the state of Missouri says, you need to stop holding public school and colleges and universities. And because we're a university in the state of Missouri, we would have to abide by that state mandate, et cetera.
So only if the state says so?
No, we also are an independent institution. We can also do things. So we could decide to hold not in-person classes earlier than the state would maybe tell us if the people who make decisions decide that that's warranted. So, but in fact, actually, Missouri Western could also do that independent of the state. But there might come a point where the state just says, we have to shut down things to once again prevent transmission, reduce the level of transmission. And at that point, if they did say that, we would be obligated by law to go along with that. We don't have that level of independence from the state. Okay, let's talk about competition instead.
Yes. Is competition gonna be on the test ball?
Whatever we cover today, so there will be questions about the COVID response.
Oh my god.
Yeah, there will. Yeah, the last question, and it'll be worth 15 points, is going to be, what is your contingency plan for COVID-19?
What is
All right. Yeah, so we'll get started. We're not going to get tons through it today, but whatever we cover today will be on there. What is competition? So think back to classes you've had before. What do you remember about competition? Somebody define it for me. Also, you're supposed to be reading your textbook. Alexis smiles. As if to say, I did not read my textbook. I used to have an activity for introducing this in class, but unfortunately, it involves the touching of lots of candy, and so we're not going to do that. I used to do a thing where I would space the desks around the room. I would put M&Ms on each desk, and then I would have you guys come in and say, okay, harvest as many M&Ms as you possibly can, and you guys would run around and scramble and scramble and scramble, and then I would send you out of the room, and while you're in the hall eating, so we would also count who harvested what, and then I would send you out of the room, and then while you were out there eating your candy from the first part of the exercise, I would pile a big pile of M&Ms up on a single desk, and once again, send you back into the room and say, get as many M&Ms as you can. What's this illustrating about competition?
Resources.
Yeah, there's a resource. There's a resource, and individuals are trying to get that resource, and that resource is in limiting supply. So competition is the process by which organisms interact in a way that they're trying to acquire limiting resources, and this ends up having negative effects actually on both of the competitors. So if you have inter-specific competition, which is competition between species, in both of these situations, species A and species B are both negatively affected because either of these species would be better off without the presence of the other species. And so when we think of interspecific interactions, we can think of interspecific interactions in terms of the net consequences for the two species involved. Predator-prey or parasite-hosts. What's the nature of the interactions? One's good for one and bad for the other. It's good for the predator or the parasite, and it's terrible for the prey or the host. So we can take any of these things. What's another one? Competition, predator-prey interaction. Mutualism. What's the nature of a mutualism? It's positive interaction for both. Think of plants and ectomycorrhizal fungi. The fungi bring nutrients to the roots of the plant, and then the plant gives sugar to the fungus, and they both benefit from this interspecific interaction. Competition, though, because each individual in the interaction is reducing the resources available, it affects both of them negatively. Now we can have interspecific competition, we can also have intraspecific competition, competition among individuals of the same species rather than of different species. But the same thing still applies. In both cases, the two individuals that are interacting in a competitive interaction suffer negative consequences because they're both competing for a limiting shared resource, and the more one eats of one, the less the other has, and vice versa. So it doesn't really matter whether it's species A and B or if it's individual A and individual B. So this is what competition is. What kinds of things can one compete for? Food, mates, shelter. Anything else? What else? Not only food, but also water. Water. When you think about territory, what aspects of territory are you thinking about? So space. So in some cases, territory might actually hold resources, and your whole purpose for holding the territory is to gain exclusive access to that resource, thereby reducing competitive effects. Another one that you might think about is predator-free space. You may carve out a territory because it represents an area where there are fewer predators, and as a result, you're less likely to become prey. What are the types of competition in terms of how the competitive contest occurs? The two examples, the whole purpose of the M&M exercise, when they're all spread out around the room, what determines who gets the most M&Ms? How quickly you can move from desk to desk collecting things. Faster individuals get more M&Ms, slower individuals get fewer M&Ms. What happens when we pile all of the M&Ms up in one spot? Who gets the most M&Ms in that case? The biggest, the strongest, whatever. How does that occur though? Somebody gets to the desk with M&Ms, and then what do?
They take all the M&Ms.
what do they do to the other competitors? They fight them off. They prevent them from gaining access to whatever the resource is. So do you guys have terms to describe those two differences in competition?
I'm sorry, say it again?
Do you have terms to describe those two differences in your head somewhere from reading or anything else? Okay, I'll give you the terms now. Exploitative and interference. Is this what you were thinking?
Yeah, just on the tip of my tongue.
Just on the tip of your tongue. Exploitation is what?
You use your own physical traits to compete something? Or-
Exploitative is related to how fast you can harvest something. You gain the most of the resource by being a good harvester of this ubiquitously distributed resource. Interference is what? Yeah, preventing others from gaining access to it. And so the distribution of the resource is going to affect whether it's an exploitative or interference competition, because if the resource is distributed diffusely in the environment, it's very hard to control access to it.
Wait, what did you say interference was again?
Interference is where you fight people off. It's the big pile in the center of the room. The resource is centrally located. Because it's centrally located and it's compact and it's dense, you can control access to it by interfering with other individuals' access to it. So that distribution of the resource would make it more likely that interference competition is going to be happening, as opposed to if the M&Ms are spread throughout the room, impossible for you to control the entire room. So because you can't control access, the way you gain access to the resource is by just being a better exploiter of that resource. So this would be in situations where resources are diffuse in their distribution. This would be a situation where resources are concentrated spatially in terms of their distribution. So when I talk about how the competitive contest is fought, prosecuted, these are the two types, and they're almost always dependent upon how the resource that is being competed for is distributed. So differences among competitors and differences in the characteristics of things being competed for, those then influence the kind of competition that is going on and is ultimately going to affect who the final victor is going to be in the competitive interaction. And so have you thought about some competitive interactions so far in this class? We didn't talk about them strictly in terms of competition, but we were talking about competition at the time.
When the Dunfly.
Dunflies. Dunflies competing for what?
Mates.
Competing for, let's be more specific.
Fertilization.
They're competing for fertilizations. Now, you can't fertilize any eggs unless you've acquired a mate, but ultimately, if you're gonna break it down to the primary currency, in this case, Dunflies are competing for access to mates. Because that access to females basically gives males access to eggs, and that gives you access to offspring, to fertilization. Now, in the Dunfly example, can you acquire a mate and still not achieve fertilization? Why?
This one will take you over.
Somebody can take you over. So what determines whether or not you get taken over? How big you are as an already coupled male to a female versus how big the takeover male is. So that affects takeover rate. So you may acquire a female, and before you have a chance to basically transfer any of your sperm over, you get knocked off of that female by a larger male. So you've acquired a mate, but you haven't gotten any access to eggs or fertilizations. Once you have acquired a female, then what determines how many fertilizations you can achieve? how long you can hang on to that female, because sperm transferal takes a certain amount of time. The longer you hang on, the more sperm you get into the other female before you get knocked off by another male. And so the characteristics of the competitors and the thing being competed for basically describe how this particular competitive interaction occurs. Is this interference or exploitative competition?
Exploitative?
Interference.
Both, right?
Yeah,
Okay, somebody tell me why it's exploitative.
I mean, there's a lot of dung patches and they're spread about.
So there's a certain degree to which the resource that is in short supply is dung patches. Why dung patches? Well, because dung patches attract who? Females. So also then within a dung patch, the females are also distributed in space. You can't control access to all of the females on the dung patch because you're just a little tiny dung fly. The only thing that you can control access to is the one female dung fly that you currently have access to as a male. Why is it interference?
Because you have to prevent the other dunflies from taking you over.
You have to prevent the other dung flies from taking you over, and the act of a takeover is basically a larger dung fly interfering with a smaller dung fly's access to the female. Now, it was kind of a trick question, wasn't it? But both questions are valid. It depends on what scale you're looking at the issue from. You have to hustle around, acquire a female, but then once you acquire a female, you shift into a situation where your goal is to essentially interfere with other males' access to that female. Is this inter-specific or intra-specific competition? It's intra-specific competition because it's just a bunch of male dung flies, all of the same species, competing for the limiting resource, which is the female dung flies. So you can think about competition in terms of water and food and shelter and things like that, but you can also think of this in terms of sex, mating success, etc. Anything that involves a resource that is of limited supply that then can be competed for by individuals, whether it's individuals among different species or individuals within the same species, those are all situations that lend themselves to competitive interactions arising. So, this is the general idea of competition. There are some conceptual ways that you can think about competition. You've already thought about some of these, in that we've talked about competition for females and things like dung flies. What types of methods did we use to think about that situation? What's the conceptual models that we used for that? Those are optimality models. So we can think of things in terms of optimality models, and you can build optimality models for competition. What is one optimality model for competition that you've already been exposed to? The ideal free distribution. We'll talk about it a little later on today, again, in more detail, but that is a competitive model, but it's an optimality model. Other models are game theoretical models. So these are kind of the two general ways of thinking about this. But they both approach things in different ways. We've already talked a great deal about optimality models, but let's talk about game theoretical models. So, game theory.
Wait,
These are just, you've seen the ideal free distribution. We've talked about other economic models like marginal value theorem.
what, is the ideal free distribution different from marginal value?
Yes, it is actually. The ideal free distribution is like people at supermarket queues, basically minimizing time in this case. But it could also be maximizing rate of gain of energy. The more individuals, well, can you just hold on until we get to the
Yeah.
ideal free distribution? We're gonna talk about the ideal free distribution in way more detail than we've
Okay.
covered it so far.
I was just making sure I didn't need to like have a firm grasp
No,
on that. It's
just-
weird.
We haven't talked about this at all. We've already talked about this because we talked some about ideal free distribution. We've also talked about the marginal value theorem in terms of thinking about dung flies and diminishing returns curves and things like that. Those are all in the optimality theory way of thinking about things. What do you guys know about game theory? This is why I want to spend a little bit of time on game theory. So let's do game theory the fun way, rather than the boring way. I'm going to show you a couple of movie clips. Have any of you guys seen A Beautiful Mind?
Is that with Russell Crowe?
It does have Russell Crowe in it.
Yeah.
He plays a mathematician, economist, theoretician, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, who invented, among others, the whole school of thought where game theory comes from.
Incoming gentlemen? Deep breaths. Yes, you haven't touched up on your papers for 5 seconds.
I will not buy you gentlemen beer.
No, we're not here for beer, my friend.
Oh. Gentlemen, I was just moving in slow motion.
Was she want a large wedding cake? Did you say swords, gentlemen? Pistols at nothing.
You remembered nothing. Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good. Exactly. Every man for himself, gentlemen.
And those who strike out are stuck with their friends.
I'm not going to strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make a friend.
I don't think so.
Alright, nobody move. You're looking over now. Look at Nash.
All right, you may have the upper hand now, but wait until your business meeting. You lost out.
History books.
Adam Smith, nature of business. What are you talking about? We will go for the blonde. We block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for our friends. They will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. What if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way. And we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid.
I'll let you finish the episode.
Best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said. That's right. Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay. Because the best result will come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself and the group. This is some way for you to get the blonde on your own. You can go to hell.
Governing down hours, gentlemen. Governing down hours. Hours.
What's wrong?
Okay, aside from the obvious misogyny of this scene, what's this scene about? It's about competition, interspecific or intraspecific? Intra. Exploitative or interference?
To avoid interference.
So in this case, it really is about interference competition. A bunch of individual males competing for what is a limited resource, in this case, a single blonde among a pool of brunettes. And Nash comes up with a non-optimal sort of solution that ultimately ends up being the best decision because of the payoffs of the two scenarios. In the event that everybody competes for the blonde, nobody gets the blonde, and also nobody gets any of her friends because nobody wants to be second place. So if we're thinking of this in Nash's words of who gets laid, the outcome for all of the individuals in the game at that point is 0 fitness because nobody's getting any action that night. If they cooperate with one another and say, let's cooperate, nobody go for the obvious, what they view as the obvious choice. In this case, each individual has potentially a fitness of 1, which is higher than the fitness they would have under the other possible behavioral option. So what game theory does is it attempts to examine all possible behaviors. It assigns value to each of these. But that value is dependent upon the behaviors of others in the group. So, game theory, in a way, makes really explicit the idea that when you're interacting with other individuals, those other individuals can affect the outcome that you experience, depending upon what behavioral strategy you adopt and what behavioral strategy they adopt. And so, game theory makes that really explicit, because if you behave one way, you might get one benefit, one level of benefit, but it might also result in another level of benefit depending on what the behavior of another individual is. In this case, Josh, what's that guy's name?
Josh.
This guy here, he brought up a very good point to the Nash character. What was his point?
Trying to get one for yourself.
You're just trying to get the blonde for yourself. So one of the options in this is that you could adopt a strategy that kind of cheats. You convince everybody else to not go for the blonde. Why? That then clears the path for you to go to the blonde. That has consequences, especially if they ever expect to go out to Mars again. You no longer have any trust of Nash because he's basically a dishonest player in the game, and as a result, you're basically going to probably try to be undercutting him in future iterative versions of the game. And so the outcome for individuals is dependent upon the behavioral strategies of other individuals in the game. So let's think about this in an explicit sort of way,
Wait.
not in pop culture. Yes, what?
I'm thinking back to the time when we were talking about group selection, and we said that animals don't do, like, they don't think in terms of what's best for the group, and that's why, like, when the fish are swimming and they all turn, it's not like, oh.
They don't, which is why, this is the limitation of pop culture references. Actually, game theory will oftentimes result in cooperative behavior, but it's cooperative behavior that evolves not because it benefits the group, but because it actually benefits the individual players. And that's what he was trying to get at, and just not say it. Because that was written by a scriptwriter, not by a PhD with a degree in animal behavior. This scenario occurs later in the book than in this chapter. Strangely enough, it is not in this chapter where they introduce game theory. It's in, I think, a chapter on mating behavior. But there's a classic game called The Prisoner's Dilemma. Are you guys familiar with The Prisoner's Dilemma? What is The Prisoner's Dilemma about? So you didn't know anything about game theory, but you're familiar with The Prisoner's Dilemma. What's it about?
Criminals are being interviewed separately, and they're given a choice to rat out their counterpart in exchange for immunity.
Two people have been picked up for a crime. The cops have no direct evidence, and so they put the criminals in separate interview rooms, and they're trying to get evidence in order to prove that these people were involved in the crime. You guys watch Mindhunter on Netflix? You ever watch any police procedural show? What do you do when you have two perps?
Separate them?
First thing you do is separating them. Cops have known about the prisoner's dilemma long before the prisoner's dilemma was ever actually put into the theoretical context. Mindhunter is this show about the behavioral analysis unit at the FBI back in its early days, in its founding days. Why is this not working? stupid Apple TV. Yeah, that's the reason. Give me a sec. I'm gonna change methods.
So are they trying to get the group to confess, or they're trying to get them to rat the other person out?
Well, so a confession, they're trying to get the person to rat the other person out. Yes, thank you. Okay, still not. Right, for whatever reason, Netflix is not cooperating. Yes, please resume. Right, Netflix is not allowing me to project. So in this particular scene, there are these two people. Why can I never remember which one is at the back? There are these two people, a dude and his brother-in-law. They're both suspected of killing the first guy's fiance, but they're not getting any straight answers out of anybody. They're slowly gathering information. Season 2, episode 6, I think it was. And so what they do is they pull both individuals into interrogation rooms, and they go back and forth between the two of them, basically lying to them in some cases, to basically get one of them to rat out the other. And the reason that this works is because the outcome matrix here. So you have two prisoners, prisoner A and B, and they have two choices. You can stay silent, or you can defect. But the outcome for you is dependent upon what happens with the other individual. So if prisoner A stays silent and prisoner B stays silent, they both get perhaps convicted for the crime, but they serve a lesser sentence because there was less compelling evidence. And so you can oftentimes convince a jury to convict a person of a lesser charge when there's less evidence, which then comes with a lesser penalty. If, on the other hand, prisoner A betrays prisoner B, prisoner A betrays prisoner B, A defects, prisoner B stays silent, prisoner A gets let off because they've cut a deal with the cops, and prisoner B goes to jail for 3 years because prisoner A basically gave up all the goods on them. Same thing happens if prisoner B defects and A stays silent. Prisoner B goes free and prisoner A gets 3 years. But if they both defect, they get only 2 years. And so the situation here is that when you look at the payoffs, the best thing would be for which individual to do what?
To stay silent.
That's not the best payoff. The best payoff for prisoner A is to defect before prisoner B does. The best strategy for prisoner B is to defect before prisoner A does.
Before or just like at all?
Well, it doesn't do you any good if
Yeah,
you
but
do it
that seems a lot
afterwards.
more risky, because if you both defect, then it would have just been better for you to stay silent in the first place.
So, but you're looking at it from a selfish perspective. This isn't a group selection scenario. It's basically individuals doing what is best for them. And in this case, what's best for you is to not go to jail at all. And so if a cop is there dangling immunity, if you rat out your other individual, you should do that because you get to go free. And so because of the structure of the rewards of the game, everybody should defect. So what typically happens is you don't get A going free and prisoner B going to 3 years. You don't get A getting 3 years and B going free. What do you oftentimes get? Mutual defection, which is 2 years, which is still, once again, fewer years than when one rats the other one out. So the nature of the payoff matrix essentially encourages defection. Now, why would this not work if the two people were in the same room?
Because you would know what your counterpart is doing.
You know what the other player of the game is doing. And you are way more likely to cooperate because you have knowledge of what the other individual is doing. Which is why, if you ever get hauled in for a crime with your buddy and they put you into two rooms, what should you probably do?
Snitch,
Nice.
right away.
Lie.
You should sing like a canary. Because chances are the other person is going to sing also, which still gives you a lesser sentence than if you cooperate and don't rat the other person off and they rat you out. So game theory basically sets up a set of rewards to the two players where the reward for each player is dependent upon the actions of the other player in the game. And we could change this around such that cooperation is more of a possibility, but in order to do that, we would have to reduce the severity of the punishments that come with defecting or mutually defecting. What do you guys know about mobsters? The mafia.
Kill people.
They whack people.
They whack people. What else do you know about them?
They would do whatever they want.
What's that?
They do whatever they want.
Okay, so they have a certain amount of power in some areas. What else do you know about them?
They sell goods.
They smoke cigars.
They smoke cigars.
They have fancy black hats.
What?
They have good black
Yeah,
hats.
is it?
So what else do you know about the mafia? Do you know anything non-stereotypical, anything substantive about the mafia?
Don't they like intercept goods that are supposed to be sold normally and then
Well,
sell?
they might. I mean, they're involved in a bunch of nefarious, illegal operations. What's the most salient characteristic about them?
They stick together.
They do stick together. Why do they stick together, Claire?
Intimidation.
No.
Because they have to, because they're like breaking the law and stuff, so if one rides.
Well, then that would be the case for every prisoner.
Well, they each have different jobs.
Aren't
They're
they-
brotherhood.
Yeah, aren't they like
They're
family kind of?
They're family. What makes mobsters so hard to bust up is they are family. Now, what does the fact that you're biologically related to one another do to your tendency to cooperate and remain silent? Probably increases quite a bit. And so mafiosos are much harder to crack because you put two brothers in separate rooms, they are way less likely to defect than if you have unrelated individual A and unrelated individual B. What else makes mafiosos less likely to rat one another out?
Well, they'll get killed by the mob, right?
The consequences of being a rat, or to quote, this actually is a quote, when I was going through this, I think it was last iteration, I think it was, the last time I taught this in 2018, when I went through this and I was talking about mafiosos, one of the students in the class said, what? Snitches get stitches. I'm like, could not have said it better myself. So the fact that they're closely related to one another, there are these familial connections, and the consequence for ratting out another family member is almost certainly death. What you gonna do?
Witness protection.
You're gonna stay quiet. You are going to cooperate, and so in that case, everybody gets the lowest, the second lowest sentence here, because you don't go free, but you serve certainly less than 3 years, which is what you would get if somebody in your family ratted you out. So game theory, once again, just describes outcomes for different behaviors that are predicated on the behaviors that other individuals in the game are playing. So if you're playing one strategy, the success of that strategy and the payoff associated with that strategy is dependent upon what strategy the other individual is playing.
What do you mean, the second assumption you've written up there, what does that mean?
Oh, so this assumption both players know the rules of the game. There's no possibility for retribution or reward outside of the game. So essentially the game is while you're in the interrogation room. This is why mafiosos work, because after you leave the game, there's a possibility for retribution, which then influences the game. So if you're a mafioso, you are in this family, you don't get out of the family. Typically, you're bound to those people over time. If you're just two random dudes who hooked up for a job, there's no reason to think that you would ever come back into contact with that person and engage in criminal activity with them again. You could, but it's not required. And so, once again, the possibility for retribution in just two random guys who met in prison hooking up for a score after they get out, those ties are much less tight. As a result, the possibility for retribution is much less likely. And as a result, you can screw that dude over without even thinking about it, because they mean nothing to you. They're gonna go off to prison, you're gonna go off and live your life, you're never gonna come into contact with them, they're never going to be able to seek out retribution.
So the mafia fails to uphold that assumption.
Yes, so the mafia doesn't hold this assumption. As a result, that changes the conditions of the game, which is why mob families are really hard to get dirt on, because there is a severe possibility of retribution, and there are also these family connections, both of which encourage cooperation rather than defection. Yeah.
So you're saying that outside factors can't influence the decision?
Yes, so in order for this to be true, these two assumptions must both be met. If these two assumptions are not met, then you have to do something with the matrix to change the payoffs and penalties of different behavioral strategies. Your assignment for the holidays, for spring break, because we're having a test on Wednesday and then we're going to continue talking about competition. But while you are away for spring break, download a police procedural or two and watch them and see how they go through interrogations. And you might want to watch, I don't know, The Godfather, classic Martin Scorsese film. It deals with mafiosos.
We'll see, might get COVID-19 back.
Well, the good thing is you're dealing with the stress and anxiety of COVID-19 effectively.
So who's making money?
Tomorrow, yes, question.
No, go ahead, finish your. It's probably just gonna be 2 votes.
Okay, so up to this for the test from what we ended with on the last test here. Now, haven't really looked at making out the test. I'm hopefully gonna work on that tonight. I'll have some better ideas for you in terms of when you have questions tomorrow after we finish making snakes as to, you want some exam prep tomorrow during lab, 8 o'clock. We don't have that many snakes to rehabilitate, and we want to have some time for answering questions about the exam. So I think we can probably do all of that in 2.5 hours. And what's your question?
So will, like, optionality model, ideal, free distribution, that will be tested in terms of competition only?
No. Yeah, because we haven't really, even the stuff that we've talked about in terms of ideal free distribution up to this point is not very firm. I might ask you about ideal free distribution at the level that we've talked about it so far. We're about to get, I think the next slide is actually ideal free distribution on steroids. All right, and we'll cover that on Friday. All right. See you guys tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock.